All right, everyone. Thanks for attending this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And this week we're going to be covering some web topics. In particular, I'm going to be going over some ways to handle creating mobile web apps. And then at the end, I think if we got time, and I think we will have some time, I'm going to go over the blog post that Greg did earlier this week about doing SSL deployments for standalone apps. But before I get started, I wanted to remind people that we have actually a bunch of sales going on, so I wanted to make sure people knew about them because they're only on for a short while longer. So let me look at my list here. Through tomorrow, that's January 22nd, all renewals of your Xojo licenses are 25% off. Through the end of January, all new licenses are 14% off. And if you're thinking of coming to the Xojo Developer Conference, and why wouldn't you be, you have until February 14th to save $100, and you probably want to do that sooner rather than later because trending makes it look like it's going to sell out this year, which means there may not be any spots. So if you are thinking, do what you need to do to pull the plug on that. All right, so let's get started here. All right, so creating mobile web apps. I'm going to open up a little project I have here. And I want to remind you as I'm talking to feel free to type questions into the question window. I see them on my other screen and I can address them as appropriate. And let me bring up my notes for this. All right, so creating a web app is pretty easy with Xojo. Create a new project as a web app. You get your web page. But when you're dealing with mobile devices, you have to think about something that you generally don't have to when you're dealing with a web page on a desktop, and that is tiny screens. So that's probably what we're going to focus on primarily here is how you might lay out your things and deal with these tiny screens and the changing of positioning and whatnot. So one of the first strategies for this is to create a page. You can see here, I just have a simple page called Startup Page. It doesn't have anything on it, but this page is going to be responsible for being the first page that the web app starts. And then this page is essentially going to automatically redirect itself to another page that's appropriate for the device that just connected to your web app. So you can see this particular page, nothing on it at all. It does have a little event handler here in the shown event, and this is just calling a method on the session, which is where I happen to put this code because it did need to be called in other places. Which takes us to the session up here, which is obviously a pretty important class when you're dealing with web applications. And we'll take a look at this show page method here. Now this is highlighting some of the specific enumerations that you're going to need to take account for when you're dealing with screen sizes. So the first thing here is it's checking the platform property of the session and comparing it to a variety of enumeration values. And right now I'm using iPhone, iPod Touch, and Android phone to essentially be the category of tiny screens, phone-sized screens where you don't have a lot of real estate to play with. And then it's checking whether these are displayed as, whether the device is in portrait mode or landscape mode. And you can see that all it is doing here is then throwing up a particular page. And we'll look at some of those pages here in a moment. But it's just a design layout. So essentially the concept here is that you're going to have different pages for your specific screen sizes. The same particular thing down here on iPad and Android. After I go through some of this code, we'll actually run these so we can see what they look like. I do have the iOS simulator and some sort of Android thing running here as well, so we can see what these will look like and how they might react to some changes in the orientations. So you can see this is just figuring out what device is connected to your web app and then throwing up the particular web page that is appropriate for the device. And then if we go down to the iPhone ones anyway, you can see that there's two different layouts here, a landscape layout and a portrait layout. Now the important thing to note when you set these up, particularly for the iPhone, you're going to have to pick a particular size that's small enough to look good on the tiny device. On an iPhone, the size of about 460 by 320, which is the non-Retina pixel size, but roughly the point size of a Retina display. It's essentially actually a real iPhone is I think 480 by 320, but you want to lop off 20 for the little status bar that appears at the top of the iPhone display. So this is a good size to work with. And one important thing you want to do is make sure that your minimums are not higher than the maximums, or you'll end up with things going off the screen that you might not be able to easily access. So this particular one is laid out in a landscape position, kind of top to bottom. And these are just empty things with just some data in here to see how they might look. There's no particular code on this page, but its companion, the landscape layout, throws things a little bit differently with some stuff on the left and then the fields over here on the right. So let's do a quick run of this. So now right now, the way that this is set up, when I run it, it's going to open up my Safari browser because that's the default browser I have here. The startup page is going to open very quickly and then redirect to another page using the show page thing. And in Safari, it's not going to hit either of these cases. So it's going to show this large page, which right here is not going to be too exciting. But then we'll open up the actual page on iOS and Android. So we can see here the web app is now running. The default page came up here in Safari. So let's switch to the iOS simulator. Now, unfortunately, because the iOS simulator only simulates Retina screens, and those darn things have a lot of pixels, it scrolls on this size screen that I use here for the webinars. So I got to do a little bit of scrolling. All right, as you can see, I already had put, all right, I'm going to click up here. Now, the important thing when you're testing web apps like this and you want to access them is you just have to punch in the IP of the machine that's running the web app. Now, in my case, I ran it on my Mac. And when you see the address here, it's the localhost address, 127.0.0.1. The important thing to note is the port. Now, I can't put 127.0.0.1 here on my iPhone that I'm running in a simulator because that would be the local host for the iPhone. Instead, I want the actual IP of the Mac itself, which in this case is 10.0.1.9, and the port is 8080, which is usually the default port for web apps unless you change it. So you can see here, this is the layout, and it looks pretty much how we laid it out there in the web page designer. Now I can come up here in the simulator and I can say, well, let's simulate a rotate to the left. And we can see that fired off, and I didn't show you that yet. We'll jump back to Xojo to see the code that it did. But it's now throwing up the other page. Well, not literally throwing up. It switched to the other page that has the landscape layout of for our iPhone. So if we go back to Xojo here, you can see we're now looking at this landscape layout. And the reason that got displayed is because on the session, there's an orientation changed event handler. And this is called when, surprisingly enough, the orientation of your mobile device is changed. And the device can be rotated 90 degrees, so it's in landscape mode, or straight up and down, or 180 for being in portrait mode. And essentially what this code is doing here is it's switching, it's calling the show page event and telling it to either display in portrait or not. And I'm combining the two left and right modes and the completely spun around modes. So if you actually held your phone upside down, it'll treat it as if it's portrait. You'll notice there's a little bit of extra code in here that's checking if the angle is the same as it was before. And this is because in my testing, I noticed that, at least in the simulator anyway, when I was testing iPad layouts, the simulator was throwing up this orientation changed event almost repeatedly, causing the display to constantly refresh, which was making it not too useful. So I just put a little bit of code in here that said, well, I don't really care if this event's called if the orientation hasn't actually changed. I really only care when the orientation has changed. So if I'm getting bogus events back from the iOS device, I can just ignore them and not bother rotating the screen. So we go back to the simulator here, and then we can rotate it back, and you can see how it keeps catching that one way or the other. Now we can switch this to a different device here, so I can pick an iPad. And the same URLs used. As you can tell, I kind of ran some of this stuff ahead of time, so Safari had remembered the URLs. Now, because these are local IPs on your local network, you know, if you're rebooting your computer or you have lots of other devices on your network, these numbers can change unless you've you know, done all the work behind the scenes to make them static. So you may find that from time to time you have to go and look up what the actual IP is when you're doing this sort of cross device testing. But you can see here, this is, I forget, I guess this is the portrait mode layout of the iPad, and we can see this here. And if I rotate it to the left to go to landscape, you can see how it changes, and I added a little bit of a map display to the bottom to use some of that other screen real estate. And you can see those pages that are designed down here. And again, nothing too fancy, just two separate pages with the screen size, the same sort of size in the case of an iPad, which would be the non-retina point size minus some amount for the status bar that's at the top. Now, one thing you can do on iOS devices, which is pretty nice, and we'll also show this on the Ssl Electronics thing. If you create a mobile web app for your user to use, having them go into Safari every time might be annoying enough. So with on iOS, you can click that little weird button at the bottom, and you can click Add to Home Screen here. And you can type in a name. It pulls in for the icon whatever you specified for your web app. We'll see how this looks also with the Ssl Electronics example, which has more support for this built in. But this adds it to the home screen itself. If I drag to the other page, so I now have an icon on here for my mobile app that the user can just click, and it comes up, and it doesn't invoke Safari, so it looks like a real app almost. You'll notice here, though, it hid the status bar, which I find a little annoying, but we can fix that by throwing some special data in. And again, I'll show you how that works in the Ssl Electronics example, which has that metadata in there that the iPhone needs to not hide that status bar. And get back to the home screen. All right, so that's what it looks like running on this particular test app looks like running on iOS using the simulator. And certainly the simulator is free if you want to grab it. You obviously are going to need a Mac to be able to run it, but you can just grab Xcode from Apple, which is a pretty big download, so it'll take a while. And after you get all that installed, and there's probably a better way to do this, but they changed it in recent versions of Xcode, is you actually have to start Xcode first, and then after Xcode launches, you got to go to the File or the Xcode menu, and then pick Developer Tools, and then pick Start iOS Simulator. And then you can quit Xcode and just leave the iOS simulator running. And I guess you could pin it down to the dock, or you probably find where the heck they stick it in the system and maybe create an alias to it. If you want to customize this icon that we see here, you just put in whatever icon you would put in here using the icon editor, which we'll look at in a moment in the other example. I just want to check my notes here. Now you can also make use of, you know, there are the locking controls that are built in here that can work. And those can be helpful when the screen sizes change a little bit. And on the iOS side, you're not going to run into that too much because the screen sizes are pretty much the same. The biggest difference probably would be the older iPhone 4 screen sizes and the newer iPhone 5 taller screen sizes. And then, of course, differences between phones and iPads. But those are probably better served by different web pages completely. But Android devices have lots of different screen sizes, much like a desktop in many ways. So you certainly can take advantage of locking with that. And one thing I can point out here with locking is if you want to center something on a page, it's not obvious, but the way to do that is to not have it locked anywhere. So this control here now is not locked to the top or the bottom, so that means it'll stay centered in its relative position as the page gets resized, which can be handy sometimes. And of course, if you've seen our blog, you've seen a little demo video and blog post that Jeff wrote about a feature we're working on called auto layout that will greatly help with a lot of this stuff. Auto layout allows you to specify conditions between elements on your layouts that are enforced as the screen that the controls are on changes in size. It's pretty cool. It does require a little bit of setup to get everything right, but once you do that, it is pretty amazing how magical your layouts just completely reconfigure and change themselves around depending on what screen is being shown. All right, so let's take a look at the Eddie's Electronics example. Now this particular example here, there's also a companion desktop app, but this is the web version. And you can see right here, it has an actual icon specified. And when you run this, this actually has screens for essentially full size, which we'll see here in Safari. So it's got a full size screen here, lots of information, allows editing and whatnot. This really would not work whatsoever on a phone, which we'll see when we bring it up. All right, this has a different port, so I got to change this port number. So you can see, first of all, on the phone, it comes up with a splash screen of sorts. And I had some trouble with this yesterday. I'm going to scroll the right thing. There we go. And then you can see how that little progress bar showed up, because what's happening there in the background is actually a thread that's connecting to the database and loading the data. And then there's a completely different search screen here that shows the names of people. So again, this looks nothing like what you see here because these are completely different pages that are designed for a smaller phone-sized device. And you can click on things to see more information. This particular design does not allow any editing, which is something that you can consider depending on how the app is going to be used. It's possible you may want only editing to happen in the full-blown version, like in the browser here in the back, and then make the mobile version only for quickly looking up information and not doing a lot of heavy editing. And then the search does what the search does. Now, if we add this one to the home screen, where is that button? Here it is. You can see right here, it pulled in the icon that we've assigned to the web app. And then it takes the default of the name will be whatever the name of the page that happens to be, or the title of whatever web page was on the screen at the same time. And then you can give it whatever you want. And this gets added to your home screen using the icon. And this particular one, I'll show you this code after, does keep the status bar at the top, which I think makes sense for a business type app like this. There's no point in hiding the status bar. I always like to know the time for one thing, and the battery, of course. All right, so let's take a look at that code. Let's go back to the home screen, which is in effect quitting the web app, which like we would do by closing the tab here. And oh, and before I show you that code, because I'll probably forget again, let me just click here. All right, this is our Android. It's not really a simulator. This is actually running Android inside a virtual machine using VMware Fusion. I have in the past gotten the Android simulator to run on OS X. Well, now I'm not getting a response here. So we're going to restart the VM. So I have gotten the Android simulator to run on OS X, but it was very, very sluggish. And I actually, when I got it to run the first time, it was a couple months ago, and I couldn't get it running again. And I tried it again yesterday. But Greg gave me a tip to get an actual virtual machine for Android that's converted to run on x86, and that might work for the purpose of this test. So let us try it and see. All right. So now it looks like the little slider thing worked. So this is actually simulating an Android tablet, apparently. And I'm no Android expert, so I'm just going to fumble along the minimal steps that I remember on how to use this thing. So that brings up the list of apps. Now, ideally, I'd be using Google Chrome or perhaps Firefox here rather than what I'm going to click, which is browser. It's a great name, browser. But apparently this version that I was able to get running, I'm just checking my notes here, is Android 4.04. I forget what their fun little catchy name for that is, but that's almost 2 years old. And the Google Play Store would not let me install either Chrome or Firefox on this version. Apparently version 4.42 is the current version, but that has to be converted by the open source community to x86 and then built. And then the other issue of running this in a VM is that typically Ethernet is not enabled because devices are all Wi-Fi these days. So then they also have to go in and add some little hackish stuff to get that working. I'd love to hear from anyone if they have figured out how to get a newer version of Android that runs inside a VM like this. All right, so yeah, it already had the page up here. So you can see here, it's displaying the iPad screen that was designed in Xojo. It even still has the text where I just put iPad because originally that's what it was designed for. And I do not know how to rotate or do anything with this. I don't know that it's possible when it's running in a VM like this. But it did recognize that it was an Android tablet. Let me get the cursor out of here. So it fell into the, oops, I'm going to switch to the right thing. So it fell into the right case statement here. So it was covered by platform type Android tablet and showed the appropriate page. So both of those techniques are very handy if you're doing mobile app development and you don't have all the devices, or even if you do have all the devices but you don't want them scattered all over your desk. You can run them in either the iOS simulator or VM, or you can try getting the Android simulator running as well, and that can be handy ways to do some testing with that. So with that diversion out of the way, let's go back to the Eddie's Electronics example. And I wanted to point out the code here that is used to when you add the app to the home screen on an iOS device. There's these specific viewport settings that are documented by Apple that allow you to control there's some particular things about how a web app is displayed. And this particular one here is ensuring that the entire height of the screen is used. And that matters for when you're dealing with the taller iOS 5 and newer devices. If you add it to the home screen, it may not stretch to use the whole height without the viewport in place. And then also the setting to make it so that the status bar actually remains visible, because for some reason by default it is not. So this is stuffing it in here in the prepare session event handler for the session. So it's only used obviously when when an iPhone is connecting, because we're checking the platform type. And then there's a similar setting that is used on the iPad to just verify, set everything to a fixed width that matches what we're dealing with on the iPad. All right. Let's see. Alan is asking if we can get specific height and width in pixels for every device when they're connected. I imagine you can pull that back from the page when it comes up by checking the page size. I haven't actually tried that. Let's see. Actually, let me make sure I quit my other ones first. So we'll have just a little page here. Put a label on it. I'll add some simple code here. I could type it right. So this particular thing is telling me this screen is set to 1340 in width, which is correct. And if I go to my Android VM, which I do not know what the screen width is, so it's 800. Well, that sounds plausible. So that can be one way that you could do that, and you could have your startup page, the one that's doing nothing, kind of capture that information for you. All right. And let's see, I have here a question from Jay. Where did I get the Android VM? I knew someone would ask that, so I saved the URL. So let me show you. All right, the one that I am using, I got from here, because it was pre-made. Actually, the VM wasn't pre-made. And you know, there's standard disclaimers apply. Use this at your own risk. I don't know who this keyable person is or anything about them, but there was a link here to a custom build that had the Ethernet fix that I was talking about. So I downloaded that. One cool thing about all these Android things is they're very tiny, so they download and install very quickly. So I downloaded this, created a new virtual machine in Fusion, dragged this ISO file onto it, and it installed almost immediately and worked right out of the box with the Ethernet connection. And there's a couple other links for people if they have a lot of free time in their hands and want to figure out how to get this working with newer versions of Android. This particular website here has lots of conversions of Android to x86. I originally went here and downloaded whatever the newest one they had, 4.3, I guess it was, which ran just perfectly fine, but it had no internet access. And I monkeyed around with it a little bit, but had no luck getting that to work. And then further research, and I didn't get a chance to do anything with this website yet. I'll probably look at this later this week. This site describes how you could specifically change some settings in the VMware file somehow to enable the Ethernet port. And you have to actually manipulate some settings in the file. This looks like it is specific to the Windows version of VMware, so I'm not exactly sure if it'll work with Fusion or not, but I'll probably give that a shot. So, Jay, those are the 3 links I have. Feel free to play around with them. Hopefully they're helpful. And Alan is asking, in general, should you consider that a web app can have most of the features that a desktop would have? And that just goes to general design philosophy. And it depends on what your desktop is to start with. As you can see in the Eddie's Electronics example, and Actually, let me open up the desktop one too so you can compare them. You can see the layout of the window here for the desktop version looks pretty much exactly the same as the layout of the main web page in the web version. Toolbar is a little different, but fields and everything are pretty much laid out the same. For some apps, you might be able to have almost an exact one-to-one match, but the important thing to remember with web apps is there's your app is running on a server, but the user interface is running on the user's web browser, which can be very, very far away from the server. So there's latency delays to consider with the design of your app that may make it impractical to have the exact same desktop design on a web. And there's also just the general fact that when code is running on the server, the UI is kind of just sitting there. So you don't have as much modal ability that you can with a desktop app where you can pop up messages and kind of freeze your code running and stuff like that. So there's certain situations where you may need to tweak your design and can't do an exact match. But you can get often pretty close. But it's something to think about. If you already have a pre-existing desktop app, you'll need to review it carefully, try implementing some things, testing for performance, that sort of stuff. If you're starting from scratch and you know you're going to want both, you can think about these things ahead of time and design them in appropriately. And Luis here is noting that it's possible also to use VirtualBox and run an Android VM, and he says that that also works great, his words. I didn't have VirtualBox handy, but that's probably a good thing to try as well. All right, so let's take a look at this EE Web example. Richard is asking about usage of threads, and there is a little example of that here in this. So we're looking at EE Web and mobile stuff in particular, so it's here in the mobile folder. And you can see it has specific pages that are just designed to be small for phone devices. But this particular page is making use of a thread to load the data. And there's actually a thread subclass that's down here in, I think, extra support folder. And then that's what's used up here. And the reason you might want to use threads is so that you can have your web app that's running on the server kind of do stuff in the background rather than forcing the web UI to be sitting around waiting. Because on top of the latency delays, you'd have waiting for the server delays, and that could be frustrating for the user. So if you're able to have stuff happen in the background and then just send the data back to the browser, you can perhaps build a better user experience. So this particular thing is an example of using a database query in a thread, which just in the background fetches all the data and then sends it back to the UI to display. The main benefit of doing it in this particular way is so that that progress bar can be displayed that says, the web app's thinking, what a progress bar usually is used for, as opposed to just leaving a blank UI on the screen that might otherwise confuse the user. All right, the other thing I want to talk about here is some of the custom styles. You'll notice when we ran the EE Web app on iOS, and is that still running? I don't think it is. It had some controls that looked a little bit iOS 7 native, but they're not. They're faked. So for example, this back button here, this little switch control that you see here, which can turn to green if it has a true value, and I don't remember which one of these might actually be set. It looks like that when it's on. So you can simulate some of that using I'll go back here to our other project here. And this is a project, and this one is included in your Xojo examples along with the Eddie's Electronics examples, of course. This one attempts to simulate some of the newer iOS 7 controls, such as buttons that don't actually look like buttons, look like labels, for better or for worse. And then this particular one is a circle image button, and another button will run it so you can actually see what they look like, because currently you can't actually do a preview of a canvas-based control, which I think these are made off of image views. This one is a canvas switch. So let's just run that, and then we'll pop it up in iOS Simulator. Running a touch device with the mouse can be a little tedious. All right, so this is what the controls look like when they're actually rendered. And you can see these little buttons here are clickable. And I clicked borderless button 1, borderless button 2. You can click the buttons. You can click that. It's coded up so you can actually press a separate button and set its property to off, and the button refreshes and goes to the off position. So much like you can with a desktop app, you can design these things. We'll just stop that from running using subclasses. So when you take a look at this, you can see that these are all just subclasses of some other control that's included with Xojo. This particular one is a canvas control, or the web canvas control, which has a pane event, just like when you're creating desktop apps. And this particular one is essentially drawing the switch control manually using a bunch of round rects and ovals and colors and whatnot. And then dealing with mouse clicks and passing them along to different event definitions and all that, and properties to set whether the value is clicked or not. So all a general implementation that you can then reuse in your app. So this particular demo, the code that's in here is actually used in the Eddie's Electronics example to try and make the app, when it runs on the mobile device, look a little more mobile-y, for a lack of a better word. So certainly grab this project, take a look at it. You can build your own controls this way as well. Wolfgang is asking here if it's possible to handle gestures at this time. I don't think so. Most gestures will work, like if you're swiping on a list or something like that. I think that does scroll. Or maybe a container that has a scroll view is probably more likely you can scroll it that way. But I don't think there's no event handler that you get that indicates, hey, the user swiped here, or something like that. Let's see. Kem is asking, does it make sense to give every page the same name so the saved homepage icon will get the right name? Oh, that's a good question. And by name, of course, I believe that would be the title. So looking here, you can see each of these. Go to the inspector. Am I in the? Look at that. I'm not even in the right one. Let's close that one so I stop going that one. All right, so I'm in the mobile section here. And the various pages all have different titles. I imagine you could give them all the same title so that that's what would the user would see if they saved it to their home screen. And really, that probably does make a fair amount of sense when you're dealing with mobile devices where the title is generally not visible anyway, because they don't show that on a mobile device. You're really only going to see it on a larger screen device like a desktop or a laptop. So that's probably a pretty good idea, Ken. All right. Let's check my little clock here. All right. Well, that's all I had to cover for web stuff here. Let me just check my notes because next we're going to want to look at this SSL thing. I did want to point out in the use of styles. You can see here in the Eddie's Electronics example, there's a lot of styles that are used to um, tweak how things look. And particularly if you're coming from desktop to web, uh, I often get people asking me, how the heck do I make something bold or do whatever? Because there aren't specific properties on the controls for that, like there are on the desktop side. There's no bold or anything here. And what there is a style property here that you can assign to a style that you've created. And a style is essentially equivalent to a CSS thing, style sheet, and it's lots of little particular properties you can pick to control coloring and fonts and borders and corners and background colors and whatnot. And you can make great use of these to customize the look and feel of your application so that it looks one way when it's run on a desktop and a different way when it's running on a mobile device, for example. And the styles you can actually inherit from other styles, which allows you to build some sort of reusability out of your structures. Justin is asking if all these example projects will be made available. And yes, I aim to please. Like I mentioned earlier, the Eddie's Electronics examples are currently in your examples with the current version of Xojo, as is the iOS controls. iOS control example is in the web folder. The Eddie's Electronics is in the sample applications folder. My little mobile web app example I will attach to the download page for this webinar when it's made available, and it will be included in the next version of Xojo. And the next project we'll look at for SSL will also be, I'll make that available for download, and it also will be included in the next version of Xojo. And let's see here. Richard is asking about easiest way to simulate a stop in processing for yes/no type dialogues with users. And that's probably one of the biggest changes between desktop and web is the modal aspect of dialogues like that, because on the website, you don't have true modal stoppage of code in the middle. The code runs to completion. And in the case of a web app, that's why there's a completely different class here called a web dialog that has its own event on it called dismissed that is called when a button such as yes or no is clicked on it. And then you're able to deal with the choice that was made. But you cannot in a web app stick, I don't have a large amount of code here. Let's see. I just want to show something here that's got some lengthier code. We'll look at the main one. That's got a lot of code on it. So you can't just stick a line of code here that would show a dialog and have this code stop here and then not have the next code run until the user makes a choice. That doesn't work in a web app. What you would instead do is the act of showing your dialog is going to have to be the last line of code in the method, and then you would continue your code in the dismissed event of the dialog that's implemented on the page. There are examples of that particular technique and how to use web dialogs also in the web folder included with Xojo. And let's see, one last question here before we look at the SSL stuff. Let's see, Bill is asking how you make a style inherit a style, and just add a new style here. And you just change its super to the name of another style. And then it'll pull in whatever's set for that particular style. So you won't have to do, and you can override it and do whatever else, of course. I probably need to go and rename these. I often will add a suffix of my styles to style, so that's a little easier when I see them in code or in other places what they actually are. And I haven't done that for this project yet. Oh, here's a fun question. Torsten is asking about Windows Phone. What about Windows Phone, he says. And I say, yes, indeed. What about Windows Phone? Unfortunately, I don't have a simulator or emulator or anything for that. To be able to run a little test on that, I would like to get one. So I'll probably do a little more research to see if there's something like that available that I can get up and running. But I don't have one at the moment. I think that would be good to probably set up if you think you're going to have Windows Phone users. But right now, at least here in the US, they're a pretty small minority. I think I hear they got a bigger slice of the pie out in Europe. So that might make it worthwhile trying to figure out how to set that up. And certainly if anyone comes across even better ways to test these things with Android or with mobile phone, I'd love to hear about it. So feel free to shoot me an email. You can write up a blog post or something like that. You can always reach me at paul@xojo.com, of course. All right, Kem is saying he can't find the iOS one, so maybe it's not in here. If maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I only added it for 2014. Yeah, my bad. iOS 1 is not in here, but that should be available on an earlier webinar, maybe. So if we go to the videos page here on the Docs Wiki, this is where the links to the prior recorded webinars are, and if they have example projects, they're also here. And I really thought I did one probably in September timeframe. Well, I'm sorry, I don't know which one it is, but I'll include it with this webinar as well in the package, and it will be in the next version, so I did just add it. Jay points out a helpful tip too. When you're subclassing anything, you can just right click on it, and actually something that's yeah, you can just right click on it and pick new subclass to create a subclass right off of it, rather than creating a new item and changing the super. That's just a general little speed tip. Yeah, iOS controls was probably in a blog post, so I can point people to that too. So there we go, September. I knew I did something in September, so I wrote a blog post in September. There you go. And there is a link there to grab that project. All right, let's take a look quickly at our Ssl example. Do I have that one open? No. All right, this particular app doesn't actually do anything. It's just showing you how you might deploy a standalone app using Ssl. And Greg wrote a great blog post about that last week. And this pretty much is just a quick implementation of that, so you can see more specifically how that might work. So this web app just has this single page. The only code on it is in this top label, the connection label, that displays whether or not you have a secure connection to the app or not. So for example, if I run it right here, it'll come up in Safari and it will not be a secure connection. So it says you have an unsecure connection to the web application. And that's for two reasons. It's not using HTTPS, and it's not using the right port. So insecure connection here. If we want to run it securely, we have to start it differently. as the instructions on the page itself state here. So you actually have to build it as a standalone, or you have to run it using the project run paused method. And I don't know if you've ever used this before, but this actually builds the project, sticks it out on the drive, but doesn't launch it. You have to then go and launch it yourself manually. And in our case, we would launch it manually by telling it to use the secure port. So either technique will work. But the other thing that's happening here is there's a copy step that is copying the certificate alongside the web app so that it'll be recognized. Now, in this particular case, there is just this is essentially a dummy certificate. It's not real. I mean, it's fake. So you certainly don't want to like, ooh, free certificate, go put this on your website and be all happy that you can now access your website through SSL. That would be a very, very bad thing to do. But it gives you an example here that you can actually run and see the page come up. So let's try running this using run paused. All right, so it's running, it's built it now, but now it's waiting for it to launch. So in order to launch a web app, we got to go into terminal. And this should be the right folder already, or maybe not. So we go into the folder, and we see that the web app is here. You see the certificate was successfully copied alongside it, so we can just launch our web app. With the port we want to use for our secure port. And you can see here it now says application is ready here in the terminal. We have to leave the terminal window open. If you close it, that'll kill the app. I'm just going to move it here off screen. And then we go back to Safari, and we'll actually have to type in the URL. So as you can see, I've done this before because it auto-filled it in for me. So I can. So I'm now connected securely. So you can see that it detected that. It says I have a secure connection to the web application, and it has a little lock icon here. One thing you didn't see, because I already tested this previously, is that there's going to be a big bad warning that would slide down that says, essentially, warning, bogus certificate, well, likely bogus certificate, or something along those lines that you actually have to approve before you can get to the page, which I've previously done, so the warning did not appear. But this is what it looks like when the web app is running securely. And that's pretty much it. If it turns out you have a web app that we can go back here and we can kill this, Control C, and you get a little bit of message back when you run it that way. If it turned out you wanted to run the web app and not allow any insecure connections at all, there's another command line parameter here for number of sockets that you want to allocate to your web application, and there's a parameter for maximum secure sockets and max sockets, which is for unsecure connections. You can set that to 0, and that'll essentially say don't allocate any sockets for unsecure connections, which will in effect prevent any unsecure connections. Kem is reminding me that in Parallels, you can download and install Android directly through Parallels, but he doesn't know what version. And yes, that is what Greg had mentioned to me yesterday, is that he had that option in Parallels. Alas, I do not have Parallels, but that's pretty cool. All right, so let me just check my notes here, but that's pretty much it for SSL with Standalone. The act of creating your own certificate is outlined in Greg's blog post and is also on the documentation wiki and will be in the user guide in the next version. But obviously you're going to have to purchase one from somebody, and then you get to put the pieces together into a text file that you then make sure gets put alongside your web app with the same name as the web app. All right, I got a question here from Richard. He says he noticed that I was calling show on web pages without closing. Well, I'm not exactly sure on the question. It says, I noticed you show pages on your web apps without closing previous ones. Is it okay to leave them all open? I'm assuming you're referring to doing the show on the pages themselves. And yeah, for these little simple demos, I often just call show to display them quickly. For a more complicated app, I probably would create instances of the pages themselves and manage that uh, outside of using show. And the main difference is when you call show, it uses what's called implicit instantiation of the pages. So the web framework has to determine if there's an instance of the page that already exists for the session that happens to be connected, and then find that one, and then that's the one that gets displayed. You can get more precision and more control over your memory and make sure that things are happening more the way you like with more complicated apps if you just manage your own instances like you would with any other class. Let's see, Fotis, hopefully I spelled or said that correctly, is asking for the SSL deployment, do the same commands apply when run on Windows? Yes, same exact commands. You would just obviously do it through the command prompt, but otherwise it would work the same. All right, so that seems like we're going to wrap up unless there's a couple more questions that come through here. Let's see. I mentioned at the beginning, we've got a lot of sales going on, so if you were thinking this year about renewing your Xojo license or buying one, do it now, or you can save some money. And then certainly if you're thinking about coming to the conference, don't wait too long to finish making up your mind, because like I said, we're approaching the end of, we're running out of space essentially, and we'd hate to have someone that was really hoping to go be denied because we ran out of space. And the conference is at the end of March in Las Vegas. Oh, and Dana's updated with some pictures from last year. There's me, lots of other people. Should be a blast. And I will remind everyone, of course, to head on over to the forums, which is a busy happening place for all your Xojo questions, talk, and chatter. And before I wrap up, I have one more question here from Richard. It says, how many simultaneous users is practical on one web app working on internal servers? Well, that's the ultimate unanswerable question. It's going to depend entirely on what your web app is doing. Obviously, a simple web app that doesn't talk to a database, do a lot of processing, could handle many hundreds of connections. One that's doing a lot of database access, maybe reading or writing, would handle less than that. And then depending on what you use for database engine could matter. Depending on what you're loading up for pictures and whatnot could use up more memory, which could cause a problem for the maximum number of users. It's going to completely depend on how your app is built. Generally speaking, though, probably 50 or 100 is probably a good ballpark to start with. And then if you need to go beyond that, you're going to start needing to think about more performance optimizations, probably better uses of threading, maybe splitting long-run processing into their own console apps to take advantage of multiple CPUs. So it's a kind of an open-ended question. All right, thank you, everyone. We will continue these webinars every week for the foreseeable future. I hope to see you again. Have a great rest of your day.